introduce our keynote speaker, Roger Martella. We are very pleased to welcome Roger to kick off our program today. We view that Roger's role is very significant in that he has opened, I believe, all three of our past symposia programs since 2020. His remarks tend to be futuristic, provocative, optimistic, and as the practice continues to evolve, so have Roger's views and insights on the natural resource practice arena and all that touches it, namely, in many ways, the delivery of energy, clean energy. By my count, in the last year, through my LinkedIn and other spies, I believe that Roger has been in the presence of the Pope, a Saudi crowned prince, many ministers of energy, and other key leaders around the globe. So we are very honored to have you in person today with us. Roger's accolades are numerous, and to conserve time, I'm only going to highlight a few points. His full biographical summary, as well as all our other speakers, is available on our meeting website. Roger is Executive Vice President, Chief Corporate Officer, and Chief Sustainability Officer with GE Vernova. General Electric Company was a founding member of this group 37 years ago, and as GE has changed, so has the group changed, and the world around us has changed. In Roger's multiple roles at GE, he engages the world's top public and private sector leaders to align GE's innovation to solve the planet's most pressing challenges of climate change, access to sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy, and improving impacts to GE's people, communities, and planets. As many of you know, Roger was a former general counsel of US EPA as well. Roger's been a longtime partner and supporter of this group, particularly in our past symposia, and we're thrilled to have him here today to share his unique views. Following Roger's formal remarks, he and I will have what he refers to as a fireside chat. You have to imagine that there's a fireplace here. And we'll take some questions between us, and then we'll open it up to the audience, both in person and online. So with that, Roger, welcome. Mm-hmm.
Barbara, thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me back. I think this is the first time we were able to do this in person, which is a real honor. It's always great to be in Washington, which is theoretically where I'm based, and so any day I'm here is a good day. And Jeff, thank you for hosting us and all the great work you're leading here in this great firm and these beautiful offices and everything like that. It's a real privilege to be here. And what I'd like to do in about 15 minutes or so is share just kind of a perspective as someone who works for a global company that helps provide about a third of the world's energy outside China in 100 different countries, travels a fair amount, gets to talk to leaders around the world, as Barbara points out, and see what we're seeing as some global trends that I think are going to really shape the future to come. And I have a lot of words on here. Barbara mentioned that being a little provocative. I always look to be a little provocative. I don't think you'd want me to be boring, and so I'm going to probably, some of this is going to be a bit provocative, I'll admit to that, but it's also going to be optimistic. And so I talk here about transformation because I feel so strongly as someone who just, had their 30th law school anniversary. So this May was 30 years since I graduated from law school. What I know is that the next 30 years, not that I'll be practicing for 30 years, far less than that, but the next 30 years are going to be very transformative versus the last 30 years of my career. And for those of you who do have those decades ahead of you or years ahead of you, it's just going to be fundamentally different. We're in a transformative era where the future is different than the past. And I'm going to walk through that. The combination of how these are environmental issues working together with industry and why that's transformative, but leading to action. Back to the theme of 30 years, that a lot of my career was defined by me saying, you know, we're just not making progress. Years and years and decades of fighting for things, but not seeing progress because we weren't having action. Well, now we are seeing action. We're on the cusp of big action. How does that lead to environmental benefits, resource benefits, sustainability, and climate change? And then this theme of optimism, which is going to be the real theme. And as I talk about optimism, I do so with this, again, the lens of a global perspective, what I'm seeing from a macro perspective. I know we all have different stresses in our days, in our lives every day. We have stresses here in Washington, D.C. There's stresses all around the world. I'm not insensitive to that. I see that. I'm empathetic to it. I live it every day. I was a public servant for half of my career. So I'm aware that many things are transforming right now. So I don't mean to make light of the various stresses that we're all feeling in different ways, especially those of us here in Washington. But I also want to, I think it's important to be optimistic. I'm joined today, I'm very fortunate by 3 of our interns. 2, I think, are Columbia and 1's at Georgetown here locally, Tia, Bernardo, and Nicholas, and they've got a long future ahead of them. And I have children their age. I have children who are younger than them. I need to deliver a message of optimism. It's something that my CEO feels very strongly about, that I think there's not a lot of positive messages out there right now for the youth, and I see people stressed about. I see the mental issues associated with it, and when I really look at it, I have an optimistic future, so I feel very strongly that we should be sharing it, because I think there's great careers to be made for years and decades to come, and a great opportunity to be part of the impact in the future. And you see on this slide here, you've seen this before, you know, the concerns about these issues, serious concerns, legitimate concerns, but also the sense of optimism starting to creep through. And that's been a newer thing, and we want to be part of that and contribute to that. So please allow me a little bit of that as we go through it. But just to kind of set the stage for, you know, how we got to this point of transformation, how I myself got to this point of optimism, it goes back to my own career. I was in public service a long time, DOJ, EPA, was at another law firm for a while. And in the late aughts, I was starting to see that the situation between that I had seen historically in my career, where the private sector and the public sector had always been on opposite ends of the table and, you know, kind of going to battle with each other. And, you know, that's what I had experienced in public sector practice. That's what I experienced in private sector practice. I was starting to see like a realignment between the public sector and the private sector, and where the private sector was wanting to be more of a force for good, not so much part of the problem, but part of the solution. And I was picking up on this from the law firm, working with my clients. And I thought, well, maybe there's something to be done here. Maybe you could have a role at a company that's really trying to be a force for good and not part of the problem, and almost create like a public sector type of role in the private sector, and not only empower a company, but empower the private sector to start to be a force for good. So this was something I was picking up on, others were picking up on it. And that's what led me to join GE back in 2017, you know, leave a law firm practice I was very proud of, but wanted to kind of take that leap of faith to see if I could do something a little different, a little more impactful. And I started to share this vision. Back in 2020, the American Bar Association held its annual climate change conference. This was just before COVID. It was in January up in New York. And historically, they had invited the people you would expect: leading academics, leading advocates, leading NGOs, you know, heads of NGOs and academic programs. But they wanted to be provocative. And they were very provocative. They're like, let's invite someone from the private sector. Let's invite someone who's not historically associated with kind of climate change activism, even though I'd done some things. I was more in the private sector hat. And it was a bit of an unpopular decision, but they wanted to be provocative, and they invited me to give their keynote speech. And I knew I had to take advantage of the provocative nature of it. I wasn't going to do something boring. And my whole speech was around how I thought whatever we were doing on climate change was not working. It was a serious issue, and it was a serious thing we needed to address. I had ideas on how to do it. Other people did, but we were stuck. And I had a provocative idea. And I said, you guys aren't going to like it, but we should run environmental issues the same way businesses run issues, hold ourselves accountable for metrics and KPIs and where we have impact, and not just do things. And I will admit, they were polite, they were professional, but it was provocative because it's not what they wanted to hear. They wanted to keep talking about, you know, cap and trade and carbon taxes and things that were not going to happen. And I shared some examples of why I thought it was necessary to be transformative. And this is all familiar to all of you. You're all scholars here. But I compared like the first 30 years of environmental law where we were like very effective in making strong progress towards air, towards water, towards cleaning up contaminated lands, compared that to the climate change era after Massachusetts versus EPA, when we're trying to address climate change using the same tools in the toolbox. And unlike the conventional pollution era, where we have so much progress to show for, and those folks here from EPA and Commerce and NOAA, thank you for all the progress and your leadership. In the greenhouse gas area, which I was very much front and center at EPA and in private practice, like we had zero progress. Like we had spent over a decade debating things, going back and forth to the Supreme Court, and nothing to show for us. I'm like, this is reality, my friends. Like you can keep having academic debates, but this is how I look at it. And I basically said, what's happening is you're trying to use the same tools in the toolbox to solve a different problem. And these tools just aren't designed to do it. They're not working. And this was, again, provocative. It was an unpopular proposition because people just wanted to move forward. I'm like, we got to take a step back at this, and we got to think about it the way the private sector thinks about how to solve problems. Dean Russell and I wrote this big article about it and how companies could be this source, how you could look to companies for maybe doing public good and how they could step in and solve for this. And then when we looked at, in this article, we looked at what is the role of companies. And basically, I was surprised, Dean Russell discovered this, that the whole reason companies, the corporate entity was created was to do public good. They were created because partnerships and sole proprietorships, they couldn't outlive anybody. So you needed a new type of entity to continue charitable organizations and do public good. And there's a whole history of how you could align corporate goals with the goals of doing public good. So it wasn't really an original idea. It's just been not kind of too common. But around this time, around the time of COVID, around the time of changing politics and things, the Fink letter, you might have remembered that, BlackRock and COP26, there was more of a focus then on how companies could do public good. And COVID was really a game changer in this, because what had happened during COVID is people saw companies kind of repurpose manufacturing lines to produce ventilators and vaccines and masks and make themselves available, put company resources towards helping communities. And people came away with this notion, maybe we can start to look to companies, not only for the work they do to be responsible to their shareholders, which is still the most important responsibility of company, but how can we align that to public good? So this was provocative, and people were looking for provocation. So I got invited back the next year to Pace Law School, which I think many of you know and has like the strongest environmental law program. So it was a big honor to give the Kirtland lecture. And I decided to take a step further. I said, I don't just have an idea, I have a solution. I think we should put the private sector in charge of climate change. Let's have them solve it. They're really equipped to do so, and let them take the lead in partnership with the government. And again, that one was virtual. It wasn't in person, so no one could like walk out of the room. I couldn't tell if they were hanging up. But it was polite, it was professional, but it was provocative. This notion that we're gonna let the private sector, after decades of like fighting with the private, we're gonna let the private sector take the lead on climate change, on energy and things like that. Like, you know, professional, polite, but really, really provocative. And this was my proposition. I said, it's no longer time to use the same tools in the toolbox. We got to switch the tools. And I won't go through this today with you in the time that we have. But I said, here's all the reasons when we're talking about sustainability, we can change the tools. And if we change the tools where the private sector is in the lead in partnership with the public sector, we can start to have action. We can start to make progress. And what you can do is you can hold companies accountable in ways that doesn't work under our current system. And I laid all the different ways that you could change the tools and make this move forward. So then finally, the next year, I was invited to go around kind of the country to lots of law schools. I guess word had leaked out about, you know, attracting a crowd. And I went a step further. And I said, I have really good news now. Like after decades of saying we don't have action, guess what? We finally have the action that we've been waiting for, because I don't have an idea. I don't have a solution. The government has a solution. This is the government's idea. And the government says, let's put the private sector in charge of climate change in partnership with the public sector. Let's let the private sector do it. So it wasn't my idea anymore. It was coming from the government. I'll show some quotes of folks from the government who were saying this word for word. And everybody thought this was the best idea ever, and they applauded, and they said, let's go ahead. How do we do it? And let's do it. And so we spent, you know, the rest of the Biden administration now into the Trump administration with this transformative notion that the private sector is now in the lead on things like climate change, sustainability, in partnership with the public sector. And this is really what I think we've needed, because again, someone who just had their 30th anniversary of law school, for most of those years, it was an exercise in frustration. We'd win some cases, we'd lose some cases, we'd take a step forward, we'd take a step back. But now we're moving in this forward trajectory in partnership with the public sector. And I feel super optimistic for the reasons I'm going to show that we're only moving forward. We're finally making the investments at scale that we've been calling for years and decades. And those investments, as I'm going to show you, are going to lead to benefits for climate, for greenhouse gases, for the environment. And that's where I think your practices fundamentally can be focused, is how do you enable the private sector to implement these projects as quickly as possible? Because the sooner you do so, the more we're going to reap the benefits, not only of those projects, but for the environmental benefits to come from those. So let's talk about that. What has kind of changed? Like, why has there been this change where it's not Roger Martello saying, put the private sector in charge? It's the government. The Biden administration, to be clear, and I think the Trump administration would agree on this point, put the private sector in charge on these issues. What has caused that? And there's really three things that have kind of led to this fundamental transformation for someone like me who's pretty old now and spent 30 years private sector versus public sector, and now private sector together with the public sector. The first has been this fundamental realignment. It begins with, I think to some extent, the Inflation Reduction Act, which some of the tax credits continue along in the One Big Beautiful Bill. But what the Inflation Reduction Act did is that was the Biden administration saying, and frankly, 50 Democratic senators saying, we are now going to use a carrot instead of a stick when it comes to addressing climate change. They had tried cap and trade. They had tried the Clean Power Plan, the Clean Air Act, and carbon taxes and things like that. And then the Biden administration said, okay, we're going to step back. We're going to be a little modest and humble here. And we're going to say, we're going to put the private sector in the lead and do this through carrots instead of sticks, which was what people like me had been saying going all the way back to the Bush administration. Frankly, I wrote a pretty unpopular LinkedIn post on this. You can probably find it, saying that this was frankly a Republican policy going back to the Bush administration. Both the Republicans and the Democrats really hated that, but it was also very true. But anyhow, you see Jennifer Granholm here saying, to make this all work, we need the private sector stepping up. We often say these investments are private sector led, govern and enables. Not my words, but hers. She said it a lot, as did much of the cabinet, John Podesta, and people like that. And then you see this chart here. This is something called the Edelman Trust Barometer. And it's tens of thousands of people in like 50 countries every year. Mr. Edelman, who I've gotten to meet a few times, I'm a little bit of a cheerleader for him. He does this survey. And the question is, who do you trust the most among institutions? And for the last few years, the private sector has been the only trusted institution, which I think is sad, right? We'd want everyone to be trusted, NGOs, government, and the media. But that goes to my point. Not only are we hearing this from the Biden administration, we'll talk about the Trump administration, we'll give them some credit too. Not only are we hearing this from the Biden administration, we're hearing this from the public at large, that the only trusted institution is now the private sector. Seeing that after COVID and how the private sector stepped up and so on, and how can the private sector address climate change? And then finally, we're seeing this notion of public-private partnerships. This is how I live every day now. I'm no longer like litigating. I'm no longer like trying to fight issues or anything like that. It's all about coming together, whether it's the Biden administration, the Trump administration, all around the world, in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America. How are we solving things together? How are we moving forward? How are we becoming part of the solution to help align what we need as a company, the public sector goals? So this has been a fundamental game changer, and it's probably where you're seeing a lot more of your time as well. The second thing that happened was the theme of energy security. And I think until the war in Ukraine, probably many of us just took the grid for granted. Like the lights go on, the air conditioning works, you flip the switch and it works. And then we no longer do. We spent a lot of our time, I think the Trump administration has been a big focus on this, is energy security. And Ukraine was really, I think, the catalyst for that. For the first time, we saw, a country attack the civilian energy infrastructure. And that was not only a serious issue for Ukraine, it was a serious issue for Europe. And how do they have a security of supply? But also we came to appreciate, as we're trying, as I'm trying, there's nothing more important I'm doing in my job, to keep the lights on Ukraine for children and parents and the elderly and things like that in hospitals. We have no strategic reserve of anything. We have years of backlog on equipment. So if I need to send a transformer or generator to Ukraine, I have to take it from another customer who's been waiting for it for a couple of years and say, I'm sorry, we have to send that to Ukraine. So it woke up the whole world that we have no strategic supply of equipment, and the grid is running on a razor's edge. So what we're seeing is a uniform understanding, whether it's Europe, the US, anywhere in the world, that we need to invest in the grid. We need to invest in electrification. And we're hearing this as a top priority for the Trump administration. And I'm on board with that, because the more we make these investments at scale for electrification, the more we're making progress towards decarbonization. So this goes back to my theme. This is why I'm optimistic, because I think if we're in this electrification super cycle, which we are, we're going to see progress for climate change. I'm going to share some numbers with you and prove it out that these investments at scale are going to drive progress for the environment. Then the third thing that happened is there's been a fundamental realignment on how the world looks at these issues. Back in the Paris Agreement and the years after, countries were reluctant to sign up to the Paris Agreement because they'd say, well, if I sign up, what's China going to do? What's India going to do? What's Brazil going to do? I'm going to put myself at a competitive disadvantage. Nobody talks about that. Nobody cares what China's doing, what Brazil's doing, what India's doing. If I go to Saudi Arabia, if I go to the UAE, they just want to be the next Silicon. They see this as their next Silicon Valley. They have to be investing in energy. They have to be investing in decarbonization. It matters to them as a country. It matters to them for their people, and it matters for their economic growth. And so we've gone from seeing something like the Paris Agreement as a competitive disadvantage to investing in decarbonization and so on as a competitive opportunity, as an advantage, as something that countries are betting their entire kind of economies on. So this has been just another fundamental change. So these three drivers together, and you see here this theme also, and I said I would give credit to the Trump administration, this theme of also how do you make energy accessible to people so that everybody has access to affordable, reliable, sustainable electricity. I call that energy poverty. So does Secretary Wright. And Secretary Wright's been very clear. The only pathway to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and lift up people's quality of life is through energy innovation. I agree with that. The more we're investing in energy, the more we're investing in electrification, it yields those benefits of addressing sustainability, access to energy, decarbonization, and addressing greenhouse gas emissions. So let me prove it to you. This is our sustainability framework at GE Vernova. We're the only company that has electrification as part of its sustainability framework. Most companies talk about decarbonization, environmental impacts, human rights. We have all of that, and we feel very strongly. But we believe it starts with electrification. And by electrifying the planet, we're also going to decarbonizing it and lead to other benefits. And this kind of proves it out. These are the results we had from 2024. We just released this about a month ago in June. And so in 2024, we put on about 31 gigawatts of capacity onto the grid globally. That's about the size of Virginia's grid. And you think of Virginia, the data center capital of the world. So we put on 31 gigawatts of capacity, 62% of that in emerging economies. So growing that access to affordable, reliable, sustainable electricity, energy poverty. We set a goal actually that we want at least 30% of our energy to go online in emerging economies to make sure everybody's having those opportunities. And we energized 71 gigawatts of transformers. That's about the size of South Africa's grid. In putting all that capacity on the grid, the carbon intensity of those emissions is 20% below the average carbon intensity of the grid. So the more we're putting that capacity on the grid, we're improving the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. We're bringing down the carbon intensity of the grid. We also avoided like 27 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions through this technology. Now, how do you put that in context? Tesla just released its sustainability report. Tesla's got a huge footprint. They said they avoided about 31 million metric tons. So, you know, if you're going to buy the Tesla numbers, and some people challenge them, roughly our impact was about Tesla's pretty significant given the size of their footprint. And we're investing in small modular reactors, hydrogen, carbon capture, direct air capture. So all of that electrification is enabling us to invest in the next generation of technologies that will help get to net zero and carbon neutrality by 2050 and things like that. So this is how these investments at scale, just for one company alone, are driving improvements when it comes to decarbonization, sustainability, and climate change. And we see this all around the world, and it's what gives me that optimism. So just to wrap this up, and this is what I share when I normally talk to lawyers. I frequently talk to law students in particular, and so this is really maybe directed mostly at them. But the 5 things I'm seeing here is, you know, clearly this is a transformative era. For me, who's been doing this for 30 years, you know, the first 27, 28 were this exercise in frustration, but now I feel like I've crossed the threshold into a new world where the action that I've been long wanting is finally coming. And we're in this era. We have to think differently. We have to recognize we're now in a different universe where we're moving forward with action. And our job is to kind of, how do we deliver on that? And how do we make that happen? We've been talking about this for decades, and we just don't have the time to spare. Like, time is working against us. We have to act with urgency. And what I do, it's not, we used to say weeks count, days count, now hours count. Every single day, like, we're working hard. And it's why we're traveling as much as we do, to make sure we're making progress everywhere we can, because days matter in what we're doing. The way we're working is differently, and this goes back to the provocation from some of those early lectures, like the notion that people have to get used to. Maybe they're more used to it now in 2025 than they were in 2020. That what matters are the results, not how we're working together. This is all about partnership. It's less about the sticks. It's more about the carrots. It's more about coming together. And the more we do, the more we drive this action. And those are the types of, when you look at the LinkedIn, you see me with these energy ministers or, various folks, it's because they get it. Jennifer Granholm gets it. Chris Wright gets it. It's the partnership here that's going to drive this success. This is something I share with the law students that, these are just the early days. I'll do what I can to help set this up. But for those who have decades ahead of them, you can have a really exciting, meaningful career. I teach at Howard Law School. I'm really proud of the class I teach there every year. I teach all around the country, various classes. And I just want the students to know that they can define the rest of their career doing something really ambitious, something really positive, something really optimistic, and have an impact. I'm in awe of that. I admire them, and want to set them up for success. And then, what's this all about? It's not about, a company or a government or any one thing. It's really about the theme of equity, that every life is important, every person matters. And all of this is about lifting people up to have the opportunity to prosper through energy, through the impacts of climate change, through decarbonization, through sustainability. And having these investments at scale, aligning them and connecting them to how you can help achieve those goals along the way. So, Barbara, I think that's it in terms of comments, and happy to chat with anything that you'd like to talk about.
So my question would be, just to get a gauge, if people online have questions for Roger, if you could raise your hand. Say it again. Or drop it in the chat, and that will be, and then in the room, just a quick gauge. Questions? Not yet? One? Okay. Couple? All right. So I think we'll start it off over here. In our fireside chat, in our comfortable club chairs next time. I've seen, I'm thinking about, Davos, set up. Say it again? No. Oh, close to my mouth. Okay. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Got it. Well, that was, what did I say? Futuristic, provocative, optimistic. I think you had all three, and I'll come up with a few more adjectives. I think that the overarching theme that is so consistent with what this group has tried to do for 37 years, and we couldn't do it all the time because, as you say, when you started, when you were at EPA and in the early days, there were no opportunities for private and public sector to communicate or interface except through formal rulemakings or on various sides of a litigation table, So the potential for collective action has never been greater, and I think that's part of it. So I have a couple of questions I'll throw out to you. The first one is, where do you see the greatest opportunity for cross-sector collaboration in the next 5 to 10 years?
Barbara, thank you. And I guess I'll go back to the theme I said is, my belief is we're on the cusp of investment. I wouldn't even say cusp at this point. We're in the midst of investments that haven't happened at scale since World War II, particularly when it comes to electrification energy. I was with the president last Tuesday in Pittsburgh. Some of you may have seen that Senator McCormick's event. He had 60 CEOs there. I forget the number of billions of dollars they were announcing investments in Pennsylvania alone. We announced 250 jobs that day at a factory a mile away on Fox Business with Maria Bartiromo. The first 12 of those people showed up last Monday. The next 12 showed up yesterday. We'll be having 12 more people show up every day in this factory that makes transformers so we can double capacity every Monday for the next 2 years. And so we're going to see investments at scale like we haven't seen since World War II. In the US, in other places, the Middle East, China, Asia, Europe, we can debate a little harder there. And I think that what we need to do is we need to deliver those projects as efficiently as possible. The Inflation Reduction Act was an incentive for doing so. There's lots that's preserved in the One Big Beautiful Bill that will keep a lot of that momentum going. Now we're talking about permitting. I think that's a big focus for this group, and kind of like a lot of the regulatory bureaucracy that could get in the way of that. So the partnership here is, how do we find ways to move the critical infrastructure projects forward? These projects that are good for not only energy security, but decarbonization, sustainability, lifting people up into prosperity, and partnering with the government in pragmatic ways that just do it as quickly as possible. That leads to jobs, it leads to manufacturing, it leads to competitiveness. Some of it's tied to artificial intelligence. As someone who spends a lot of time there, like, there's an imperative there to make sure that we are being competitive on that front as well. So I'll go back to the theme, like, days matter at this point. And so we just need to be working very quickly in partnership with the government, with various private sector stakeholders, with public sector stakeholders, to be moving forward as quickly as possible, given the scale of where this is headed.
Understand. I'll do one more question here,
Sure.
and then we'll maybe throw it out to the audience, and then can come back and talk a bit more. So there's a lot of onus on the government to be a synergistic partner, for sure. And so how can companies, as well as government agencies, better align incentives to work together to achieve various objectives, accountability to drive joint progress, you know, on some of these goals, the decarbonization, biodiversity, which is a big issue in Europe in particular, watershed health, these kinds of things. In other words, are we set up, you know, we know what we've set as objectives and needs, but are we set up to move ahead as effectively as possible, would be my answer. And if not, what additional would be needed?
You know, if you're going to kind of buy the overall proposition, you don't have to, by the way, I'm sure many people will push back on it, that, you know, going back to private sector taking more leadership in this. On the government side, the government wants to see projects executed. And so they're going to collaborate and align on that. And I think that's their goal at the moment. They want to see more energy on the grid, and that's the priority. And so I think there's alignment there. But they may not necessarily say, what are you doing on biodiversity, or how are you addressing that watershed? That may not be necessary where the government finds its role at the moment. So the question is, how do you address that? And this gets back maybe to the slide that I really maybe could have spent another minute on, but didn't, which is, what I said is, we were changing the tools in the toolbox for companies. I don't want to say, just trust companies, please. Don't interpret my comments as that, like, just trust us. Like, just let us do it. Don't worry about it. We're going to go fix. That's not at all what I'm saying. And on that slide that I did go through pretty fast, I talked about accountability. And so companies need to be accountable for those types of things. We're accountable for our emissions. We're accountable for our waste. We're accountable for biodiversity. We're accountable for our water use. We're accountable for human rights and how we treat people in our communities. The government may not hold us accountable for all those things, but we have to be held accountable for those things. So how do we do that? And this is one of the benefits. This is why I'm optimistic, is back in my day, you know, most of my career, if a company were doing something that maybe wasn't aligned to those goals, what happens? You all know better than me. Maybe someone finds out about it, and then the government starts to investigate it. And that takes a couple years, and there's back and forth, and, you know, people disclose stuff, they don't disclose stuff, you fight over this, you go years through that, and then maybe you find something, maybe you don't. And if you do, maybe you litigate it, maybe you settle it, maybe a court issues an opinion, maybe it doesn't, maybe there's a change in administration. So there's a lot of this like zero-sum game that takes years if something's going on. In my world, where you're putting the companies in charge, that's no longer the case. It's much more transparent, because what happens is, all it takes is an email or a phone call from an investor, an employee, a stakeholder, to say, I want to know about these emissions. I want to know about this project and how it's impacting human rights. I'm on a call with them, if not that day, within a couple days, holding ourselves accountable. They may be writing a letter. There may be some discussion about, back and forth. Is there going to be some greater attention here? We're disclosing things voluntarily. They can challenge everything you've seen. We have a 140 pages report. So it's not the government like looking around to try to find us. It's us going out there and being proactive, sharing this, and then being accountable in ways that happen much quicker and faster than the government could ever do. So that's what leads me to this opposite. It's not like trust us. It's like actually we're more transparent. There's more avenues for kind of holding us accountable. And I think this is one of the tools that really helps make sure we're delivering on these bigger things. So are we committing to the right things? And just before this meeting, I had a call, and Tia and Bernardo and Nicholas were there. And we're actually setting goals. The call we had about an hour before this meeting was with our whole sustainability council, about 30 people in the company that represent all our functions. And what we said is, what are the gaps we have as a company? What are the things that we're not doing well on sustainability that we could be doing better? And we had a debate. Is it water? Is it biodiversity? Is it chemicals of concern? And what are the areas we have to progress? So that's an example. The government's not asking us to do any of that, but we feel from our stakeholders, we need to be accountable for it. And so we're going to be disclosing more programs that make sure we're addressing those types of gaps.
You're going to need a mic. So where's Reg? So that people can hear it online.
Yeah, I was going to get your views, again, on the optimistic take of the last several decades, right, of effort and trying different tools, as you put it in the toolbox, maybe not the right tools, but what do you think the role is of all those efforts getting us to where we are today? And were those in some way either necessary or help now inform kind of a wise choice on a public-private partnership?
No, Jeff, I would agree. I mean, we probably wouldn't be in this place today if people didn't push the envelope on, like, say, Massachusetts versus EPA. That was a game changer of a decision that really kind of legitimatized, the debate around climate change from the Supreme Court. So even if from a regulatory perspective, I would argue it hasn't led to much. From a setting the stage, it certainly was critical to the foundation. Now, do I wish we could have started this era of action sooner? Yes, maybe we could have gone around 15 years of debate, instead of 15 years of debate, maybe 5 years, and we could have leaped forward sooner, but that's okay. Like, we're there now. But I'm in agreement with your proposition that all of those actions were necessary. And to some extent, maybe we had to try cap and trade. Maybe we had to try carbon tax, because in my view, I think it's fair to say we tried, and I think this is where the Biden administration landed. The Biden administration for their first year came in pretty aggressive. They tried to do some of the things that had been done before in the Obama administration, whether that was, I think they tried a cap and trade type thing. They tried to do more regulatory stuff. And I think they realized pretty quickly that that wasn't going to fly. And so then they repivoted themselves, I think, with some humility, and said, what we care about the outcomes, we have to move forward in a different direction. So I think we did have to test all those other things to get to where we are today, where I think we're now more in a private sector type of leadership space.
We'll need to give you the,
We do have a question online after this one.
okay.
Thank you, Roger. David Kreutzer, Colorado Attorney General's Office, speaking for myself, not the state and not my employer. I share your optimism, and I've had good relations with various opposing counsel representing industry over time. Most of the time, I'm a regulatory enforcement lawyer. So I want an explanation of some of your assumptions. For example, I like the idea that more electrification leads to more decarbonization. And I recognize that many fossil fuel-free sources of electricity are cheaper than some of the traditional fossil fuel sources. On the other hand, I have to note that the United States is the world's largest producer of hydrocarbons. I need to note that EPA, I'm not sure where the inside EPA reporter is, but last week inside EPA reported that the new administration is not pursuing an all of the above strategy for energy production. So what are some of your assumptions behind the idea that more electrification leads to more decarbonization?
David, thank you. It's a totally fair question. And first of all, I'm a big fan of the Attorney General. He and I clerked for the same judge, the year part, Judge Ebell in Denver. So big fan of Phil. And thank you for your service. So it's fair to say there are assumptions. As a matter of fact, we're so transparent with our assumptions. We have about a 25-page appendix to our sustainability report where we walk through every formula, every assumption. Challenge us on them. I'd love it to. We want to be completely transparent. And some of these, we have to make some judgment calls. I welcome when people challenge us on those judgment calls. So I don't want to overstate it. But to be fair, which is a fair question, I'm thinking very globally. And so I'm looking at, I think of our effort here in two stages. How can we make improvement in the near term trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions, and how do we make kind of more transformative changes in the long term to get to kind of net zero, which is where I think everybody wants to be. Because the reality is our technologies today that we can put online are not the ones that get us to net zero. Those are breakthrough technologies that we're innovating today. So if we think near term, if I think globally, we look at the carbon intensity of the grid. The carbon intensity is too high because lots of places are still on coal, they're still on diesel. They're not using energy very efficiently. So the more we're electrifying today with our equipment, whether that's gas power, nuclear power, renewable energy, that's bringing down the carbon intensity of the grid for the long term. And that shows the improvement. Now, come next decade, we'll want to see new technologies like carbon capture, hydrogen as a fuel, small modular nuclear reactors, direct air capture. And then that makes progress towards the ultimate goal of getting to net zero. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's how we look at it with a global scale. You could look at any part of probably a state, of a city, of a part of the world and say, well, maybe there the emissions are going the wrong direction because there's more, fossil fuel development or so on. But we're looking at it very globally given our footprint. Thank you.
Any other questions in the room for Keegan? And then we're going to go to online. We have one on, okay.
Okay. Roger Keegan Brown from Lowenstein Sandler. Thanks for your remarks. One thing you mentioned as you were responding to one of Barbara's questions is the importance of other stakeholders. And I'd be curious as to your perspective on engaging the community. I think in the context of this discussion, we often think of the government as a proxy for the public. That can be true, but it's important, obviously, that the community where the projects are going to occur is supportive. And you don't want something derailed at the late stage if you find out the community doesn't really want that. So what have you found to be successful strategies and opportunities to get early engagement from the community to make sure that this larger scale project to either electrify the grid or otherwise reduce carbon emissions gets the support that it needs to get all the way over the finish line?
Yeah, thank you for asking it. It's so critical. So we have in our sustainability framework, you saw the framework of those 4 pillars. We make it more complicated. We have something called the control room, which is based on like power center control rooms, which is how we operate it. And so one of the fundamental themes is stakeholder engagement has to be across everything we do. From beginning to end. So there's 2 kind of overall truths to our sustainability governance. One is stakeholder engagement, which includes local governments. And the second is our principles, which are credibility, transparency, and it's been a while, credibility, transparency, and impact. And so on the stakeholder engagement, our role could be a little different because we're the manufacturer of the equipment. So our customers, the developers, whether those are kind of public utilities or in some cases governments themselves, they take the lead in the stakeholder engagement. We will do that frequently with them, explaining the technology, explaining the impacts of the technology and the benefits. The other place we play frequently in stakeholder engagement is kind of on the human rights side and in the communities. We want to make sure if our technology is being, both from our supply chain, like we're very, very hyper-focused on any kind of labor and human rights issues associated with our supply chain, which involves a lot of direct engagement with our communities. I should say safety too, because lots of parts of the world don't value safety in the same way we do, and we're always having to work to make safety better. So there's a lot of community engagement on safety and human rights on the supply chain. And then when we know we're going to have a lot of technology going into a community, maybe another part of the world, we want to make sure we're not just making something in the US, we are the major manufacturer in the US, and just selling it there. How are we lifting up that community? So increasingly, we talk about domestic content. How are we making sure that there's a local content to the equipment we're providing? Like wind is a good example. Nuclear is another example. We're innovating small modular reactors. We don't want to just make them in the US and ship them to other parts of the world. We want other parts of the world to be invested in the small modular reactor supply chain, the wind supply chain. And then there's also education. So a part of our sustainability commitments that we have committed to touch 30,000 students between now and 2030 from underserved communities. And what that means is if we're going to, expand into India or somewhere in Southeast Asia, we're going to do STEM programs, or we're going to invest resources to make sure we're going to underserved communities, giving them educational opportunities, bringing them back to our research centers, giving them the opportunity to get fed into our work system, and trying to touch those 30,000 students in a way. So our community engagement is not so much at the project level, because our customers handle that, but kind of upstream on the supply chain, and then downstream in terms of how we're incorporating domestic content and the educational components so that the communities get the benefit, the economic development benefits of the technology that's going in.
I'd like to go to the web individual. My colleague Tara Wakeham Flynn will handle that. Yes?
Thanks, Roger. This question's from Jennifer White of the Yakama Nation, and she's asking to please share your ideas about incentivizing conservation. An abundance of electric and other energy comes with significant environmental impacts like heat pollution and environmental damage of construction projects with fragment habitats. How would you bring environmental awareness and conservation into the incentive structure?
Yeah, Jennifer, thank you very much. My first job at DOJ was in the Indian Resources section, working on the trust responsibility on behalf of tribes. So thank you for articulating that. I certainly respect and admire the role that the tribes play in terms of being the best stewards of their environments. And I think it goes back to maybe similar to the last topic, is we need to be working with the local, communities to make sure that these projects are aligned in ways that bring both the economic benefits, I talked about the supply chain and the training, but also cognizant of the environmental benefits, and making sure, if the Yakama has its own permitting and standards, of course, compliance with that, but the consultations, the tribal consultations, the community consultations, and that they're at the table at these decisions. That's something that has to be important, I think, for our customers, for the developers of the projects. And conservation, everybody needs to understand, what are the environmental ramifications of these technologies. I think we're pretty transparent in disclosing that in our sustainability report and so on, but the operational, you mentioned the heat impacts, I'd like to think that would be covered during the permitting process. And then, I'd like to think in 2025, we're at the point where any type of project that we're developing in a community would be a net benefit, and there would be a lot of consultation and back and forth to make sure that the community sees it that way too. I'd like to think we're past the point where, people are just plopping things down in ways that aren't in that type of consultation. If there's examples of that's not aligned to that, I'd like to know more about it and hear it. But hopefully the process is factoring that in.
Does she have a response that she needed to say anything further, to take her mic off? No, all set? Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Good morning, Roger.
Morning.
Steve Goldberg with Stoll Reeves. So I wanted to take a step back on the transformative related concepts, and instead of looking at it more sort of globally, maybe look at it at a smaller level to see how that transformation takes place within the company, within the leadership of a company, and how you, I guess, even though and GE may be, I think, more sophisticated and maybe ahead of the curve in terms of looking at things in terms of sustainability, but maybe other companies aren't there yet, and that needs to be an education internally. So what are some of the things that you can do to help that transformation take place at the corporate level?
Thank you, Steve. And what we see is again, as a global company, we developed this framework before any elections. We're a global company. 25% of the world went to the polls last year. We had to come up with something that we thought was durable for the whole planet, and we could communicate regardless of any election that could happen anywhere in the world, changing politics. I'd like to think it has been pretty durable. And I think what we get back to is, who are we here to serve? Like, we have to succeed first as a company. And I feel strongly about that. If we don't succeed we could have all the best goals in the world. If we don't succeed first as a company, that's all for nothing. So we're here to serve shareholders and make sure we get them a return. But then how do I align that success for our shareholders to these broader sustainability goals? And that's where our framework comes in, because we believe we can do both. We can give a great return for our shareholders. And, I didn't put a slide on this. We rang the bell on the New York Stock Exchange on April 2nd, 2024. We became the top performing stock of 2024 after we rang the bell. So I just make that point, not to brag, but to make the point you can succeed as a company, but also I think we're proud of our sustainability performance that you can do both. So how do you line that? But then the other thing I'd say to those companies who maybe not be as out there as we are in sustainability, we're pretty out there. You can look at our website. We're pretty out there, I think, in a very credible way. What you're not seeing sometimes are the conversations you're having with your investors and your customers and your employees. Because even if the world said, we're no longer going to require sustainability from a regulatory perspective, the EU has stepped back a lot on what they're requiring. Our investors, you get on the phone with them, they still care about this. They're still holding us accountable. Our customers are holding us accountable for it. And who's holding us the most accountable? Our employees, both the employees we want to retain and the employees we want to recruit. And that becomes a big differentiator for us that we can show them. And I have some interns here. I'd like to think they would agree with this. You can ask them when after I leave. But a sense of purpose has become increasingly important to the employee base, and being able to show we can succeed for our shareholders, but we can also succeed for a sense of purpose, electrification, decarbonization, conservation, thriving, has been a real differentiator for us in recruiting the best talent and retaining the best talent.
Question in the back, Alma Cartland.
Thanks. Good to see you again, Roger. I'd like you to put an industry hat on, or maybe even something broader. You talked a lot about coordination, et cetera. Just in discussions that I've been involved in, there seems to be a lack of confidence, perhaps, in the supply chain for particularly environmentally friendly energy equipment. So, which I think sometimes drives decisions to go to fossil fuels, natural gas predominantly, when thinking about new capacity. And then, of course, there's the whole permitting issues, which I think everyone agrees the government has some role to play there. Do you think that system is not broken, or what has to get better, perhaps, and how can that happen if we wanted to make things even better for taking on a kind of corporate social responsibility?
No, I agree with your proposition. Supply chain is tough. We have more to do there. I think we're in the early stages, I think with good intentions. So the way we think of our supply chain is through circularity. And we have something called a 4R framework, which is how do we rethink, recycle, reuse, and repurpose our products. And that goes all throughout our supply chain. And we've set a goal that by 2030, 90% of our products will be within that framework. But that's an ambitious goal given how hard it is, but we're not overselling it either, because it shows the level of the work. And so when you get into supply chain, again, the global nature of supply chain in particular, some places, like you look at Europe, very aggressive on these topics, other parts of the world, perhaps less so. And so that's something we have to work to solve every day if we're really going to stand up proud in 2030 and say, if I were invited back 5 years from now, who knows where I'll be and what I'll be doing. But if that would be something I'd like to say we were able to solve for over the next 5 years, as we've been able. I know we're going to have a lot of more electrification on the grid. I can predict that. I do believe sincerely the energy we put on the grid is going to lower the carbon intensity of the grid. It's going to bring greenhouse gas emissions down. I believe we're going to make progress on small modular reactors, carbon capture, and hydrogen in the next 5 years. Supply chain to me is one I feel less confident about and where we have to put more energy into. Yeah. Sure, sure. If you look like, again, human rights and people, I think we've made a lot of progress on that. That I feel pretty good about. It's more the environmental circularity part of it. That's a bit more challenging.
Jay, go ahead. We got about 5 more minutes of questions.
Thank you. Jay Pendergrass with the Environmental Law Institute. So I want to go back to some of the themes that other people have covered. In terms of accountability for corporations, I mean, GE Vernova is huge. What about the small and medium-sized companies, which is, as we've known for a long time, where most jobs are being generated and a lot of the innovative ideas are coming from, but they don't have a Roger, they don't have a sustainability officer. So how do the things that you're working on get moved down? And is that through supply chains, or how does it work?
Jay, first, great to see you. I think it is through the supply chain. So think as big as we are, we're a small cog in other people's supply chain. And they hold us accountable in ways that, frankly, we need to do better. I'm not here to say our own performance is perfect. There's many of our customers who would say, come on, Vernova, you got to get better here. You got to get stronger. We get that all the time. And we take that seriously. And we do have to get better in a lot of ways through our supply chain. I mentioned our meeting an hour ago was, what are our gaps? And we've got some gaps, and we're going to work on those gaps. That goes all the way through the supply chain. For our suppliers, we're going to have that same conversation. Maybe we have more conversations with them because they're not as far along. But if they want to do business with us, they have to, because even if we decided we're just going to go, for whoever lowest cost, whatever, our customers won't allow that because our customers are holding us accountable for our supply chain. So that gets back to the slide that I kind of skipped through. It's like, don't trust us. I'm not saying trust us, but there's this pressure from customers, investors, employees kind of is self-correcting in catching everybody up to that we have to be moving in that same direction. So they are hiring, folks. They may not be chief sustainability officers, but they're hiring folks who are much smarter than me, people with degrees from MIT on supply chain, on how do they kind of become more efficient, use more conservation, be better stewards, because they have to report that to us and we have to report it to our customers, and we're accountable for it. So we're going to hold them accountable for it.
Thank you. So we're nearing the end of our fireside chat, but I have a question for you. You've been around the world in the last year. You've been to so many places. You've talked to so many people. You have so many audiences, government, et cetera. When you think back, what is the one moment that you think of as the most significant professional moment that you've had, or the most outstanding professional moment that you've had in the last year? What comes to mind?
There's no close second. It's Ukraine.
Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. We take it seriously when people are targeting, the lights for kids and things like that. And they've done an extraordinary job keeping the lights on. So that's the most important work we're doing.
Yeah, that's very meaningful. And I see that that's an emotional issue for you. We will hear actually today a little bit from Rick Winning in the next panel, actually. And although he's not going to focus on that specifically, he's done a lot of work in the restoration of the tremendous damage that has been created by the conflict. So, well, this was a very, very interesting, and as I say, all the adjectives that I thought. We hope that you can stay a bit with us. That would be great, at least for maybe the next panel, or whatever you can stay with us would be great. I know that you're busy, but this was great, and the fact that we did it in person this time is fabulous.